Welcome to this industry webinar brought to you by the Cyber Hut and Strata Identity. My name is Simon Moffatt. I'm founder and analyst at the Cyber Hut. We're going to take a look at the whole role of identity providers, why we have too many, the impacts that has to your organization, and more importantly, how we can try and rationalize identity and simplify our single sign-on solution. A couple of quick introductions. I've been fortunate enough to be in the identity space about 25 years, which is a scary thing to come out and say. But over that time, there have been some significant business changes, technological changes, and nothing more really around authentication. It is constantly evolving, constantly changing how we've moved from on-premises systems to cloud systems, a whole host of different ways of authenticating with MFAs and passkeys and everything else. And the role of the identity provider has changed fundamentally over that time. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be in conversation with Aldo here from Strata. Aldo, how are you doing?
Doing fantastic, of course. Thank you, Simon. Hello, everyone. This is Aldo Pietropaolo with Strata. I'm the field CTO. I have 23 plus years in identity and access management. So actually, my entire career has been in identity, and I've been blessed to be part of some of the startups beginning in the year 2000 with Securant with Eric Golden, which is the current CEO of Strata, all the way through my own startup, which is called Good Dog Labs. And back in 2015, I think, we started to implement the microservices architecture into the identity landscape. And we actually created a product called Perseus IAM back then that did identity data rationalization, normalization, transformation to get it ready for IGA, IGA implementations. And over the years, just like you, Simon, been blessed to see the industry evolve, and I'm really excited to be speaking to you today about the IDP ecosystem and IDP rationalization, as well as unification of all that greatness into user experience.
I love that. I think it's great. I think that's such a broad journey to get to guess where you are now, and it's probably between somewhere around about 50 years experience, which in itself is just that's just crazy. I don't want to hear that. That sounds like a totally old Luddite. But I'm certainly looking forward to unpicking some of your experience and some of your knowledge in the webinar today. And I guess, what are we going to be talking about? Well, a few things really is set the scene, I guess, early really, and unpick, what are identity providers? Why do we have too many? What is this sprawl concept which is emerging, and the real impact that it's having for many organizations? And how and why are we going to be trying to rationalize this? The benefits to rationalization. And I think that the really interesting aspect for me is it covers lots of different parts of the business. It's not just a nice to have for the IT teams or the operational teams. The impact for the business is many, and it's varied, and we're going to dig into that in a bit of detail. And then we're going to wrap up with how to get there ultimately, a strategy for evaluating, understanding that existing landscape, and then obviously putting in architectures and solutions to orchestrate to a better single sign-on world. So let us start off a little bit of a foundation, if you like, the current sort of situation around IDP proliferation. So those identity providers, the real backbone of our access management stories, been around 20 years, I guess, commercially. Typically in the old days, that internal intranet-based sort of single sign-on thing, usernames and passwords bolted into an LDAP directory, given access to internal web systems. Clearly, we've come a long way since then, and we're finding them sprouting up across a whole host of different areas. And we did some anecdotal research at the Cyber Hut. We do polls relatively frequently. We did a couple of polls looking at this stuff maybe about a year or so ago. 56% saying they have between 2 and 5 identity providers. 4% of respondents said they have more than 5, which is a little bit scary. Another little sort of factoid to add in there as well, orthogonally, is how many different MFA solutions organizations have. Now, not always the same as the IDP numbers, but we are still seeing this multitude of MFA components. So suddenly you may have 4 or 5 different identity providers And then within those identity providers, you may well then have 4 or 5 different MFA choices as well. So suddenly the metrics add up around operational control, support, upgrades, etc., etc. Things start to just proliferate. And there's a whole host of reasons here, Aldo, isn't there? Why this has happened. You've got legacy systems, you've got that technical identity debt in there as well. The hybrid landscape, is that something you're seeing as a real issue there as well? And I'm sort of referring to this on-premises, cloud, SaaS sort of ecosystem which many organizations face. Is that a big deal for many, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a big deal. In fact, we see that constantly, and more we see enterprises with what we would consider enterprise customized hybrid landscapes, like private clouds and private infrastructures that are, either directly connected securely to an existing public cloud like AWS, GCP, and Azure. But what ends up happening is that in larger enterprises, because of security regulations and so forth, and security policies and requirements, customers create a what we would consider software-based networking configuration or perimeter, meaning that no, long gone are the days where customers literally have a firewall infrastructure into the internet. That firewall is being deconstructed in favor of software-based networking configurations and perimeters and so forth. And security software has evolved as well to adapt in that scenario. But what we're looking at now is also identity software trying to adapt and keep up with this hybrid, landscape. And it's easier said than done. This is why, one of the major items here for today's, webinar regarding IDP, proliferation is because things are moving so quick and architecture patterns are evolving very quickly, and you have everything from, open networks that are open to the internet, but yet still securely connected to, let's say, a cloud service provider for that specific, entity or company. You have that all the way up through the application stack where it's also being abstracted. Think Kubernetes, right? And think orchestration for the application itself and infrastructure. So as that whole infrastructure and ecosystem has evolved since I've been involved in the year 2000 until now, um, historically, identity, and I'm not sure if you agree, Simon, but identity stacks have been left behind from a deployability, from an architectural perspective, a design. They've been left behind, and that's one thing that, for example, Strata has noticed since the year 2019, when Strata was, or late 2018, when Strata was just coming into the industry, is the big objective of uh, creating a new form of identity solution that not only takes advantage of what has happened in IT within the past couple of decades, but can also set a precedence of what's going to happen in the future regarding identity and help people protect against that fast-paced evolution, which, tying it back to IDP proliferation, leads to things like multiple identity providers, especially when customers are going through mergers and acquisitions.
Yeah.
It's real key because the identity stacks, software stacks, are somewhat still legacy themselves, somewhat. Not completely, but they still follow legacy architecture patterns and so forth. They're not as agile to actually quickly move and connect everything. So customers end up with this hybrid, cloud environment, but also multiple identity providers that are inherently disconnected. So that's kind of what we're dealing with right now, IDP proliferation. In fact, every single day here at Strata, we talk to major global enterprises with this exact same problem. So everything that you have here on this slide, we see every day.
I think it's as you said, there's a lot of reasons behind this, isn't there? You know, as you say, it could be business sort of integration or merger sort of stuff where okay, that's a great thing for the business from maybe a revenue perspective, but then you're not thinking of the underlying technical wiring ultimately, are you? It's not something where you think, oh, we need to, consolidate this stuff, and it's difficult. You know, there are different integrations in place, different systems relying, maybe different protocols, IDCs, SAML, proprietary web, sort of cookie stuff in there as well. And it's difficult. It is complicated to go and sort of rewire your identity stack. You know, you don't typically go and do that stuff very often. 6, 7, 8 years, perhaps you may look at your identity fabric and start to reintegrate applications or change some of those access management components. It's expensive, it's difficult to do. The barriers to exit are quite high because you may well have customized sessions, cookies, tokens, all of the relying systems. So it's not an easy thing to do. And again, back to this hybrid landscape issue, it's difficult. You know, you mentioned Kubernetes. Maybe you have a SaaS system, you've got an on-prem system, you've got compliance to deal with. You can't just go and pick and choose and rapidly re-engineer systems that quickly. And back to this, where do you start thing on visibility? You know, not all organizations understand really where all of their identities reside, you know, who owns those identities, how they should be managed, what's the governance life cycles, and then what systems are reliant on the authentication mechanisms. Seems quite an obvious, or maybe an unusual thing to say, but you can very well have multiple sort of layers of applications reliant on cookies, assertions, or whatever, which are not necessarily fully under control, especially if they are third-party systems, for example. So it's easy for us to say, oh yeah, too many IDPs, that's a bad thing. But there's a lot of underlying complexity there, I think, isn't there? It's holding organizations back, I think.
That's right. That's kind of what I wanted to highlight. The multiple IDPs is actually a symptom, right?
Yeah.
The root cause is everything that you've been talking about now, especially the agility that business requires to move is extremely fast nowadays, right? And identity systems just cannot move that fast until now, of course. I mean, we're innovating here at Strata to ensure that we can help customers move fast as part of unification of the single sign-on experience.
Yeah. I think it is difficult. I think identity is going through a transient process. You know, we have the importance of identity is increasing. It's not just a sort of productivity enabler anymore. It's empowering data security, endpoint security, network security. There's the whole sort of B2C external identity world in there as well. So identity is doing a lot more, but it's been spread across more systems, more identities, more identity types, more relying parties. So it's just doing more. I think that in itself is definitely a transient problem, which it's making this IDP proliferation a
Yeah,
difficult
and it
thing
typically,
to manage.
I've noticed, Simon, that businesses typically do not see this until they see it, if that makes sense, where it starts impacting their business in a real meaningful way. So we have customers that because of a misconfiguration of identity or because a partner or a major customer cannot access, let's say, a portal in a timely fashion. We have some customers that, for example, deal with state and federal governments where lack of access actually means danger to constituents, to people, right? And when people cannot, let's say, have access to a very important drug that they're taking because of the lack of access to state and federal systems and their partners, which is all identity driven, then that's a big problem. And I've actually seen this happen. This is not like I'm trying to pretend to create a problem. I've seen this happen where people get denied access, and it causes big problems. In addition to other use cases where businesses do not realize that they're spending an enormous amount of capital expenditures on identity providers without realizing that it's not really necessary, and the lack of visibility that they have until they go through a compliance challenge, let me put it that way, that requires them to put a magnifying glass on the identity stack, then that's really when they open their eyes and say, whoa, I've got a bigger, to your point, root of the problem here, and the multiple identity providers is just a manifestation, a symptom of what my root problem is. So when we speak to enterprises, we tend to also bring in the business element and help our customers think through and work through how identity is actually impacting their bottom line. And in most cases, I would say most cases, we are able to identify exactly and trace the impact of identity to their business process and their business outcomes.
Mm. I think this it's a real it's a real an overlooked thing around business outcomes to identity. You know, identity is there to empower the business to be successful, and be that productivity, security, revenue generation, share more, do more, etc. But it's imperative that identity is tied into a business outcome of some description. And I think that is often overlooked and neglected. It can be quite complex to do. It can be difficult to measure and map and tie those things together. And I guess it's on that extension. There's probably a stakeholder on here which we've skipped really, or one
For
I've
sure.
missed off is it is the end user, which is that usability. It's usability of the consuming user of a system, but also usability from an administration perspective, which is sort of it could be operational productivity there. But you know, if a system is not effective, it's not delivering user happiness, it's not allowing them to complete a job function or a task within the workforce or a transaction online from the B2C space, that's a pretty big stakeholder which is going to be really unhappy there. So, you know, if we look at this problem like holistically, productivity, having to manage multiple systems, there's an operational overhead there, of course, costs, support, upgrades, integration, that just proliferates onwards. And again, you get this wrong and your help desk is constantly being hit with reset requests, lockout requests, credential issuance style use cases. That's another spike that has to be dealt with. Clearly, security is not going to be improved. You know, poor monitoring, inconsistent authentication MFA flows, multiple IDPs. They're going to have multiple different ways of logging in. So there's a security inconsistency problem here. Reduced hygiene by design. Clients aren't going to be happy because they're going to have to go to multiple systems to understand the landscape. Which systems do we have in place? What identities? What authentication levels are we using? Etc. To me, the reason why this is a big problem, one that we've sort of heard more at the cyber, is it's impacting all parts of the business. You know, you get this stuff wrong, and it isn't just impacting operations and IT. It seems to be a cascading problem. I think that's probably a fair word, cascading.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Yeah, that's true, Simon. Absolutely. These are different, what I would say, problem areas or problem categories, but overarching this is a company's business model and operations, because that's what they're in business to do business. Right? They're in business to be a
Yeah,
profitable
that's
company,
it.
unless
Yeah.
you're a nonprofit. So, in order to operate a company and do business, you need people. And those people are digital versions of themselves somewhere. And the better you can attest to those people's access privileges within your infrastructure, that the better you can increase their productivity, the better that you can provide compliance in order to avoid compliance fines and so forth, the better it is to operate your business, and the more risk you are reducing to the operating model of the business. So ultimately, to your point, identity does hit the business, and historically, we in identity and access management have been keenly focused on the technology, which is great, fantastic. We virtual directories, single sign-on, session management, multi-factor authentication, encryption, you name it, identity providers, OIDC, SAML, et cetera, and even back in the day, Simon, you remember WS Fed, WS Security, SOAP.
Trying to forget that stuff actually.
Yeah, trying to trying to forget all this stuff, but all this coolness in technology, which is great. It's phenomenal. But now I think, and I'm seeing a trend is these stakeholders that you're highlighting are keenly focused on these business outcomes. So nothing really moves within the enterprise right now, what I'm seeing, unless there's business and technology stakeholders that are completely aligned as to what the impact to the business is identity having. And when I say identity in general, I mean identity and access management, which encompasses all identity and access management capabilities from authentication all the way through IGA. Right. So yeah, it's changing, and I think addressing us as subject matter experts in identity, the more we can focus on addressing the business problems with identity, the better we're going to be moving forward versus putting the technology first cap on and then leading with technology first and then having the business outcome as the afterthought. I don't think that's going to pass muster moving forward. I think that it's switching now fairly quickly from what I can see.
Yeah, 100%. It's the old adage, isn't it? If you can better describe the problem, you're halfway to the solution anyway. And I
That's
think
right.
that's often the case with complex technology, which identity used to be, this complex middleware. It was often let's build something straight away. Let's build a solution.
Yeah,
Let's go and do some
that's right.
stuff. Whereas actually, if you just spend a bit more time on articulating the business need, the business weakness, where's identity helping, where's it hindering, then you can much more simply design a solution to be successful there. All right, so a little gear here to look at the use cases ultimately. And what we're trying to say here is, look, we've got this identity provider sprawl or sort of proliferation. It's not good. It's not good for anything really. It's impacting multiple parts of the business. So what we're trying to fix here, what we're trying to solve, and how we're going to try and do this. I think there's a couple of ones I want to pull out here, and I think absolutely this legacy word. I don't love the word legacy. I think, but I do use it because I think it amplifies the fact that organisations, they do invest in technologies, but they do so at the right time. They make the right decisions at that time. But clearly things move on, and having older systems, should we call them classic systems, they need to be collapsed, consolidated, migrated, etc. So there's definitely an aspect there. But I think there's also things like migration and transitional use cases. On-prem to cloud is a big obvious one, but there are others in that journey as well. Maybe altering user interface sort of flows, changing how end users interact with different systems, introducing sort of resilience and failover improvements. These are all sort of transformative use cases, which can be very difficult to do without interrupting business process or interrupting user experience or onboarding or whatever it could be. So having quite a lot of sort of transformation or transition use cases, I think is quite important. I think it's having that overlay mechanism, isn't it? So you can allow your systems and the business to change what they do, but minimizing the impact. I just wonder what your
Yeah.
sort of take is on those sorts of use cases.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's spot on. And we've identified particular different set of stages that a person that's leading a global enterprise, IAM enterprise program goes through. The stage number one is on the lower left here on the slide, the unification of single sign-on, because they're trying to immediately solve the problem of customer access, workforce access, those two things, and solve it in a way where they do not disrupt business functions, business operations. And to your point, identity has grown and evolved to the point where there's multiple identity providers, and your poll was spot on. We see on average with our customers, 2 to 5 IDPs, in some cases up to 7, 8 IDPs. And in the larger identity sprawl problems that we solve, we see these IDPs become global and regional and in availability zones within those regions, but also you are now seeing, or we are seeing, problems regarding identity data sharing between those zones, as well as controlling the way a user's experience is underway when a user's trying to access a protected resource globally. Whether let's say you are in Asia and you're trying to access a resource in the central United States. What does that really mean? Or if you're in Europe and you're in a GDPR governed scenario and enclave, what does that mean when you go out of that enclave and out into the internet and hitting the central United States from both user experience of single sign-on, but also conveyance of the user's authenticated context?
Mm.
That's a big problem to solve from the technical perspective. The business calls that lack of single sign-on, global single
Mm.
sign-on. And the business also interprets this as expensive multiple identity provider licenses and tenants. But but to us is really like from a technology perspective, oh yeah, there's federation involved, there's OIDC involved, there's SAML involved, there's local rules and policies in country, in region, in availability zone that in our case tells the Mavericks orchestrator what to do, what to release, when to release it, why to release it. So it's very important to look at the bigger picture and tie that to the business, and that's kind of the unification of SSO, the U. Then we see enterprises from a use case perspective transition into the M stage or the modernization stage, meaning
Mm.
that once you've landed, you've unified, you've created a unification experience across your identity providers, then you're looking at modernizing infrastructure, modernizing applications with the simple goal of then moving on to the next stage, which is rationalization, rationalizing IDP rationalization, which means now that I've modernized my applications, or I know exactly where the applications need to be modernized, then in the lower right hand of this slide, then we go into IDP rationalization. And this is where it becomes fun because you're able to disconnect other identity providers that you do not need any longer, and you start realizing on average of 1.4 million in savings, hard savings from licensing every year. And that's where the business is, this is interesting.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah. And then the last stage that they move on to is, no surprise, resiliency, right? Upper right hand in quadrant in your slide, which is phenomenal, by the way, the resilience and failover improvements. That is the last stage that we see our customers naturally gravitate towards to. And that is when they have realized an IDP rationalization stage successfully, and they went from 7 IDPs to 3, just giving you an example. And then they start asking the question, well, how can I make this resilient globally? So if Simon is trying to access a protected resource, no matter where that's hosted globally, how can I make it so that it is resilient if one or two of my identity providers die? And how do I intelligently route him to the closest identity provider that can provide the authentication context for Simon for that particular application? And the last thing I will say is that this this UMRR, acronym, as I'm kind of seeing it, it actually accelerates. So if you can envision a pyramid, maybe an upside down pyramid where the foundation is unification of SSO, then the M stage, the modernization, you start accelerating towards your journey. You're kind of going downhill in the skis. And then from M you go to R's, which is IDP rationalization. You're really loving it. You're skiing on the moguls. You're hitting the moguls going downhill, great powder. And then you tie it off at the end of a great run with resilience. That's
Mm.
kind of what we're seeing. So as you actually land with unification and end with resilience, you're accelerating IDP adoption and you're rationalizing your environment, and then you're at the same time you're modernizing your applications and infrastructure. And this is interesting. If you're using an orchestration topology, an orchestration architecture, which I'm biased, right? Yeah, because I believe in what we're doing at Strata, and I believe in the power of orchestration layer. Then you are abstracted for good, meaning you can pop in new
Yeah.
IDPs, take them out, pop in new attribute providers, take them out. You have so many, areas of flexibility across each identity capability that the value there is just tremendous. I personally believe that that abstraction orchestration layer is going to be pivotal move towards a future, you know, identity infrastructure, identity architecture, almost a standardized approach to ensuring that you remain uh, at that speed. To your point, the kind of like I've heard you say, which is great, the speed of business.
So much value to unpick there. And you talk about sort of big transformation systems, and what I often certainly observed in the past is you go through, I don't know what it could be, maybe it's an authentication change or whatever, or an application rewrite, and you do that stuff. And then after 3 years, you sort of back to the beginning, and you have to do this all over again because you haven't
Yeah.
really decoupled or abstracted and taken out the logic from the data and everything else. And I think
Right.
with this sort of overlay model or an orchestration model, absolutely, there's a sort of land expand. You go through your UMMRRR, your acronym that you've trademarked there. But once you get to that end point, you're not having to do this again. You're starting and then you're leapfrogging to a new architecture, a new world, which then allows you to be future proofed and adopting new systems. And 2, 3, 6 years from now, who knows what the sort of authentication du jour is going to be? It could be earprints or it could be some sort of
Yeah.
virtual reality thing. You don't want to have to rewire or re-engineer your entire application stack. It wants to be a BAU situation. And I do like as well the resilience thing. I think as identity becomes more strategic and more pivotal in how you do security, how you do privacy, how you do productivity, it's more important. So it can't be offline. It can't be unavailable in different geographies. It can't be delivering degraded experiences. It has to be the same for everybody in every region, every geography. And even if you do have an outage or a cyber threat or a data breach or whatever it could be, you want to recover fast. And I think being able to do that consistently is important as well. So I see some real, as you said, architectural changes which organizations will strive towards. And that sort of it's shoehorns a little. We've touched on this a little bit already, but the outcome relevance here, the business benefits of looking at, we've touched a little bit on this already, but clearly there's a massive cost one, isn't there? There's a cost thing around, look, streamline infrastructure, streamline the systems you're using. There's the licensing cost, which is an obvious one, really, but also that consolidated support model. You're going to have fewer systems to upgrade and to patch. By design, that's going to be simpler and easier, either for internal personnel or external support contracts, consultants, maintenance, upgrade, etc. So you're going to save money there, and the money you save, you spend elsewhere, whether it's on yourselves or whether it's on application redesign or other things. So it's saving money to then generate more revenue elsewhere, which I think is a double win. I think back to that speedy business thing, the more you have a resilient, flexible, integrated architecture, you can deliver more. You can respond to external change. You can help the business deliver applications, services, products, whatever the business is doing. But it's more composable. You're developing and delivering IDP and authentication services where they're needed at the speed of business for the systems that need them. Risk is an obvious one. Risk is going to go down. Your security posture is going to be improved. You're going to have consistent MFA or passwordless or passkeys or whatever it could be. You're going to have consistent or reduced session management capabilities. Maybe consolidate federation protocols as well. Maybe moving from SAML to OIDC or just reducing the breadth and depth of different variants of that. I was doing a workshop recently, and they had, I think it was 4 different OIDC providers, and they all did it different. And it was like, this is a standard protocol, but the OIDC tokens were all different, and by design, they then get validated differently. So your security risk, clearly, it sounds like it's going to go down if you have consolidation, consistency, and you mentioned things like that, resiliency as well. So there's a lot of wins here. Am I missing any? It seems too good to be true, this.
Oh yeah, it does seem too good to be true, and I gotta tell you, this is day in and day out for us. So it is true, but I will tell you that it takes that foundation first, the unification first, and that is that is somewhat of a lift. It comes with a lift, but it's not an extraordinary amount of lift there, where it's not going to yield a negative business outcome, or it's not going to yield a negative return on investment, to your point. And it's just phenomenal, right? Because they get all these squares, right? They get the visibility, they reduce the costs, to your point, especially obviously the IDP licenses, which are astronomical. From what I mean, I've been doing some math there, and we're doing math, and I'm like, wait a minute, this is substantial for a large enterprise. And then the increase in agility as you're modernizing and abstracting, and then the reduction of risk, because by default, when you're centrally controlling a distributed environment through, let's say, orchestration, and you have that visibility, then you're simplifying the architecture over time. So you're going from 7 IDPs to, let's say, 3 IDPs or two. Have more than one IDP, and then you have abstracted. Let's say some of our customers have abstracted 200 plus applications. I mean, it's an insane amount of applications, and some of them have 1,000 applications. And the big value there is abstracting the app and then introducing new mechanisms to reduce risk for the application landscape. And you do that through the orchestration and abstraction layer, because since all the apps are abstracted, then you integrate new protocols, new protocol versions, new ways of protecting applications, and new ways of providing cybersecurity controls for these apps, and providing new visibility and telemetry, which is very important. For example, asking the question, what is Simon doing, within the past week across 1,000 applications? What does that telemetry look like? Send that, for example, telemetry to an open telemetry environment, or to a Splunk, or to another SIM to report on your access specifically. And then longer down the road, and I know this is really down the road, is how do we include AI into this whole model, where you're able to ask a model questions about your particular environment, and that model is trained on your environment specifically, but also a model that has an inherent identity and access management advisor. So one of the interesting things that I've done is I've actually created a virtual AI identity advisor based on 10 years of data that I've collected across hundreds and hundreds of implementations that I've done personally, across federal government, state, commercial, etc. I fed that into the model, and I created basically a chat, interface for the model, and you ask it a question. I have these 3 identity providers. I have these types of applications based on identity and access management knowledge for the past 10 years that you've you know integrated and imported, and based on these 8, 9 identity capability areas with attributes and so forth. Tell me what steps should I take, and in what sequence, and create a roadmap for me. I asked the model that question the other day. I freaked. I freaked out. I was like, what? I was like, this is insane. It literally told me protocols, the integration approach, the roadmap, what stage to take when unifying single sign-on, all the way through resilience, the different stakeholders that are involved, the estimated costs on average of the IDP licensing, being reduced. It was incredible. So if you're able to do that to virtualize an advisor, and I'm thinking of opening up the model. I'll send it to you, Simon. See what you think. You ask it questions and see if it kind of astonishes you. But if we're able to do that now simply, could you imagine what we're able to do in 7, 8 years, in being able to maybe create agentic AI models that actually do things based on that intelligence. Anyways, that was just a quick segue, but I think it's important to start thinking about that now, because I've been involved in that today, and it freaked me out in a good way.
think the opportunity is huge. Yeah, the opportunities are huge, but again, there's a lot of guardrails and other things to put
100%.
in place there, which is I guess equally terrifying and an opportunity for some as well. So let's sort of move on to the last sort of bucket,
Yeah,
if you like, for webinar. And how can we get there? How can we look at solving some of the things we've described? It clearly is a big problem. It's a proliferating problem, but equally the benefits to getting this right are also huge, and that they clearly impact multiple parts of the business. So I want to discuss some of the actual nitty gritty, if you like, of how to get
yeah,
there. What does it look like? There's multiple products on there. First of all, the Oktas of the world, and Microsofts, and there are lots of other IDPs out there. Your Pings, your ForgeRock's, and on and on and on. How easy is it? Is it a real simple vision to say, look, we can collapse, consolidate, overlay, because they're all going to be these commercial products. I guess first of all, they're all going to be doing different stuff, and by that I
right.
mean you manage them differently. The configuration is differently. An identity in Okta is different to one in Entra. Things like the configuration of that is different. So, is it possible to sort of normalize and integrate? What's the secret sauce here?
Yeah, it's definitely possible to normalize. At a high level, what's required is an orchestration layer or a set of orchestrators. And basically, what the orchestration layer does is think of a symphony, musical symphony, right? And you have the conductor, and the conductor is conducting every single instrument in the symphony. It ensures that you have a great work of art, right? That you have a great symphony going and everyone is playing their role. That's kind of how the orchestrator works. So the how piece of the orchestrator is pretty simple. You just deploy it in the environment, and there's multiple deployment models. And if you're talking about Strata's orchestrator, it can be deployed in a Kubernetes cluster, for example, or you could use a more traditional architecture approach behind localized load balancers and global load balancers. And you could even run it on bare metal if you want to. It's actually a very small binary that you can, no pun intended, orchestrate across the ecosystem, orchestrate across the infrastructure. And once you bootstrap that orchestrator and it's running, it's environment aware, meaning that it knows where it's running. And in this case, you have two very simple environments. One is the environment in the organization one, and there's another environment in organization two. And what's key here is that each orchestrator is identity fabric aware, and it's also application fabric aware. The identity fabric that the orchestrator constructs is through configuration. So I can configure it. I can go into a SaaS UI that we provide, and you can click and add, in this case, Entra ID, add Okta, and add CyberArk as part of your fabric for that organization. So that's the how part. You install the orchestrator, bootstrap it, make sure it's running, and then you go into the Mavericks user interface and you configure the identity fabric and the attribute providers as well for each identity provider. So keep in mind that the orchestrator also implements a schema layer or schema abstraction layer. And that schema abstraction layer is very important because you need to represent different source data or source attributes differently to different applications. So depending if a user is going to one application versus the other, so application A or application B, the user's journey, for lack of a better term, is different. To your point, there's different requirements on the application, and there's also different requirements in the identity provider. So maybe the application is mainly supported by Okta, and Okta has most of the attributes for the application, but not all of the attributes. Maybe the application requires authentication via Entra, but attributes from Okta. Or maybe in this case, to make it a little bit more complex, it requires a conditional policy in Entra, authentication from Okta, and another capability from CyberArk, let's say some attributes, to be conveyed to the application. How in the world are you going to do that at runtime seamlessly and through configuration? That is the orchestration layer. right? Where you configure your identity providers, you configure your attribute providers, you configure your schema abstraction layer, and then last but not least, you configure the user flow between the identity fabric through the application. So you configure how the user is authenticated, how the user is going to be authorized, and then what protocols to use to convey the user context to the application. Now, in a merger and acquisition perspective, global expansion, et cetera, in this particular case, the unification comes with integrating organization two into the picture. So let's say organization two comes in, and that's an infrastructure, running in Europe somewhere. You can install an orchestrator localized there in region, and then configure that orchestrator to speak to the orchestrator in organization one. So it is technically possible to, let's say, have Simon hit organization one as part of a request and authenticate through the orchestrator, and then extract Simon's information and send it to an application in organization one. But it's also possible to authenticate Simon, authorize Simon, package Simon, and send Simon's authentication context to organization two. The orchestrator there in organization two receives that context and can additionally augment Simon's information from localized identity providers and localized identity stores to then finally repackage Simon and his authentication and authorization context to send it to a local application running in organization two. Now you've authenticated Simon in organization one and not in organization two.
Mhm.
That is pretty cool. Like, to be able to
Powerful.
trust and
Yeah.
convey Simon from organization one into organization two without necessarily having overly expensive identity sync or overly expensive federation trust, et cetera, and vice versa. Authenticate users in organization two and then federate them into organization one through the orchestrator, establishing that unified trust, as I call it, within both organizations. That's the how. Of course, there's a lot of configuration goes through that you have to go through on both organizations. Things like identity provider configs, attribute provider configurations, things like SAML configurations, certificate-based configurations to ensure that things are signed and encrypted and trusted in both organizations. But the end result, as soon as you land in this environment, is, let's say, two orchestrators and then the unification of single sign-on from one organization to the other.
I love that. Love that. There's so much nuance in, as you said, trying to do this separately, if you like, as you say, through complex federated architectures and others. I mean, one question I would add into this though is obviously with there's commercial vendors on there. What about sort of that customized, homegrown IDP, the open source
Yeah,
thing or something which has been built? Does that fit into this simply
it
as
sure
well?
does. Yeah, we love those. In fact, we thrive on those. So yeah, we support custom IDPs. In fact, you get through our UI, you can configure one, and it has a generic logo because it's meant for a custom identity provider. And if your identity provider speaks OIDC or SAML or even a custom protocol, right, we're able to implement that. And one thing I didn't mention here is that the orchestrator here that we have at Strata, you're able to interject the request response in multiple stages, and you're able to do custom logic as well. So there are very custom use cases in some scenarios where you would need to implement what we call a service extension, which is like a plugin that plugs in into the orchestrator, and you tell the orchestrator what to do in special circumstances.
No organization is sort of greenfield. They have a whole
That's right.
hodgepodge of systems and extensions. And yeah, I've been there and felt that pain. And I guess we're sort of wrapping up towards the end here. And a couple of things, how to get there. And this is, I guess, the sort of side put sort of typical tactical strategic identity transformation sort of view here. And if you are looking at authentication, clearly there's a few things to look at. One is security, obviously. Um, Whether you're looking at things like NIST and sort of authentication assurance levels, but you need a way to measure the sort of output of the authentication event, as well as usability as well. And going in and you sort of say, look, doing an assessment of your existing landscape, it isn't often actually that organizations sit there and go through usability and go through security of these things. So it is an important thing to start. But I guess just from your sort of point of view, we could talk about the sort of individual MFA components, but at the IDP level, what is that criteria between keeping one, retiring one, migrating it? Is there any sort of, you mentioned the sort of virtual advisor thing there. Is there any sort of secret sauce or way of thinking about, which IDPs to target, which ones to start first? What's your sort of view there?
That's a great question. The major factor that I see in talking to customers is cost.
Right.
Which one is more expensive?
Yeah.
It's really
Yeah. Which one is
the major
yeah,
question. I mean, I'm just being
leaky
very
more?
open, right, and transparent.
No, it's a
That's
good
the very
point. Yeah.
first question that they ask.
Yeah.
And then once they identify the most expensive one, then they ask, how can I switch off of that and how fast? So the how can I switch off of that is an interesting question. The biggest questions that I see in the how can I switch off of that is, does it does the receiving identity provider, or the one that we're going to, does it support the same conditional policies? That's number one. Oh, it does. Great. Does it support the same authentication mechanisms? Passkeys, passwordless. Yes, it does. Great. Does it support all the modern protocols, SAML, OIDC? Great. In some cases, we dig very deep. We almost have to dig. Like in the OIDC scenario, does the grant type support DPoP, right? Proof of possession.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds crazy, but we have to dig that deep because in certain scenarios, some IDPs don't support that. And we have some customers that are talking to Strata and say, hey, can you provide DPoP regardless of the identity provider? And the answer is yes. That's another powerful aspect of the orchestrator is, let's say you click on enable DPoP for certain grant types for OIDC, and boom, it ensures that that's implemented across IDPs. And yeah, so it's very nuanced to your point. But those are the key questions. Number one is, which one is more costly, and can we get off of that, and how fast? And we spend a lot more time in the how and can we. And we go through deep protocol assessments, application assessments. To your point here, and one of the things that is a favorite of ours is your first two arrows. Start small and correct stakeholder engagement. Once you do those two things, then you could extrapolate into the larger ecosystem, into the larger enterprise. So the authentication assessment here is really important, and you've highlighted it here. Rightfully so. Usability, security. Do we get the same strength of cybersecurity capabilities? And if so, uh, how do we migrate off of the old identity provider to the new one? And and here's where the M, Simon, comes in. Modernize the applications into the new identity provider, because so most applications that they have, they don't support modern protocols. But we do. So what we do is, on one side, we support modern protocols. On the application facing side, we support the custom protocol that the application recognizes. And that's very important. So us being able to give our customers the confidence of being able to modernize, move from one identity provider to the next is by going through very thoroughly, going through these assessments that you have here in the slide, and then enabling those use cases with configuration primarily. We try to stay away from any code whatsoever. And if we do identify areas where we do need to, let's say, write a service extension, my main job as well is to help productize that so that we get away from any code. So we're constantly evolving the orchestrator and supporting new protocols, new capabilities, and so forth, and even different types of legacy single sign-on mechanisms. Like, I'll give an example. We're now working through Kerberos use cases where, as you know, it's been sometimes challenging to provide single sign-on to Kerberos protected IWA Kerberos protected applications. The question is, how do you modernize those? How do you go from a protected IWA Kerberos app to, let's say, OIDC that's provided by CyberArk and Ping? That'll
Step away from that one.
yeah, step slowly. But see, the thing is with Strata, we lean into those things because it's just first of all, it's so much fun to do, but but second, we make that much easier to do as well. But anyways, to your point, overlay no code, right, is what we aim for as well as centralized management with our solutions.
You mentioned Kerberos gets a bit of a kick in these days, but it is tough, and it's. I think the other thing to add in here as well is if you are looking at things that overlay, maybe future protocols which you haven't considered. You talk about Depop there and other stuff which is emerging, and you don't know what's going to happen in the next 3 5 years. So the more you abstract, the more you can pivot and I guess take advantage of what may be happening in the time ahead. Ultimately,
Yeah,
been a fabulous sort of meandering journey here, Aldo. We really learned so much around the problem space and uncovering how organizations can get there. I think there's a real opportunity, I think, for organizations to not only, as you say, modernize, unify, modernize, rationalize, and become resilient. Your UMA trademark is good catchphrase there. But it just shows there is a maturity curve there, isn't there? There is a time progress
definitely.
maturity curve which organizations can adapt. It sounds like you guys have got a really broad, strong platform of capabilities there to be able to try and do this. There's a few links there which I think will probably get sent out afterwards around how organizations can leverage demos and material and start to build their journey here. But are there any sort of final last words from yourself before we wrap up?
Not really, just that it's been great. It's fun to talk about this stuff, and thank you, Simon,
Not
for
at all.
doing this.
Not at all.
Yeah,
No, it's you love Kerberos and IWA and these weird things. So it's great. It's great to hear how organisations can benefit from some of this. 'Cause we see this problem a lot. We get asked about assessments and how we can change things and how we can sort of help there. And it's definitely this is a big problem. It's a growing problem, and I think the more identity becomes more important, things like resilience, unification, and abstraction will become very much in vogue. So I think it's a great opportunity you guys have. So thank you for sharing your wisdom and your anecdotes. And I guess thank you to everybody for tuning
thank
in and
you.
watching. And we will see you next time. Thank you.